I got my folder out and I laid out on the desk in front of him all the information I gathered. And I said, you should take me because I'm really serious about working for you because I've done all this homework. And right near the end, he said, you'll definitely be hearing from us. Until somebody can identify DNA that says this is a natural born salesperson, I'm going to have to stick with the fact that it's a learned skill, it's a learned behavior. Every time you knock on the door and get told no or something a bit more explicit, it's one step closer to the yes.
My guest for this episode is Simon Hazeldine. Simon works internationally as a keynote and conference speaker, sales transformation consultant, and as a sales and negotiation trainer. He's spoken in over 30 countries, and his client list includes some of the world's largest and most successful companies. Simon has a master's degree in psychology and is the best-selling author of 10 books that have been endorsed by a host of business leaders, including multi-billionaire business legend Michael Dell. He's also the co-founder of one of the UK's leading sales podcasts, The Sales Chat Show. I first heard Simon speak back in 2017, and I loved his no-nonsense approach to sales and pitching. So I'm delighted to have him on the show to share his wisdom. If you enjoy what you hear, please leave a review, like, comment, and subscribe. It would mean the world to me and will help this podcast reach as many people as possible. You don't want to miss this. Enjoy. Simon, welcome to the show. My first question for you, in life, what's the most important thing you've ever had to pitch for?
Oh gosh, looking back, I would say it was pitching for my first proper job with a very professional, leading, fast-moving consumer goods company, Dominic. What I didn't realize at the time was that I was going to get some of the very best sales training, in the country, in the industry, and that turned out to be one of the best things I did. I've got to be honest, it was largely kind of by accident, but I'm really glad that I did. I went to and this is this is how old I am. So this is kind of pre the internet being very available. I went to the local library and sussed out and read about the company in the business directories and photocopied all of these pages.
Amazing.
And in the meeting, it was a tough kind of interview, and the guy was, not aggressive, but really pushy. And he said, so why do you think we ought to take you? And I got my folder out and I laid out on the desk in front of him all the information I gathered. And I said, you should take me because I'm really serious about working for you because I've done all this homework. And he went, interesting, right? And right near the end, he said, you'll definitely be hearing from us. So yeah, and then I ended up with them for 18 years, right? So I'm getting all this incredible training and development. So that looking back, I didn't realize it at the time, but that was probably the most important pitch.
Amazing. Did you ever speak to him after the fact, a couple of years down the line about that job?
He became my line manager. So
right.
Yeah, we worked together. We worked together for 2 years. So he was helping out the people who were recruiting for a more general new business team. And then he wasn't actually recruiting himself, but on the basis of the interview, he decided when he had a vacancy, he hoiked me into his team. So I got a promotion
Brilliant.
out of it, as a very fast promotion. So, hey,
Before you even started.
You never know where a pitch is going to go, right?
And who distilled or instilled that that kind of work ethic and that curiosity? Because not many people would do that. Like, not many people would go and I absolutely recommend they should, but you went to a level of research that most people don't. What was the influence behind that?
I think at that stage, if I recall, I was at university, a couple of years prior to that, and I was doing these fairly, dodgy jobs that students do. And at one stage, I had this job, fascinating. It was great fun, but in a bingo hall and an amusement arcade, right? So the guy who owned it was a self-made multi-millionaire. And like lovely guy, but kind of semi-illiterate, but incredibly good at making money. and I think he was a bit of an influence on me in terms of aspiration, because he'd
Mm.
drive up in his white Bentley with his personalised number plate, and I thought, oh, I fancy a bit of that. And one of the other people there was really into self-help books, which is kind of ironic considering we were all being paid the princely sum of $150 an hour. And he gave me, he said, oh, you have a read these. And it was like, I think it was How to Win Friends and Influence People, Dale Carnegie, Rhinoceros
Yeah.
Success by Scott Alexander, and a couple of others. And somewhere in there, they must have talked about preparation and planning. I can't consciously, and I was really into the
Yeah.
Rhino philosophy of Scott Alexander. So it must have come from that. I can't consciously answer your question. It's a great question, but it must have come from somewhere. The idea that you got to be well planned. It's probably Dale Carnegie somewhere, I would imagine. That
I can
seems like the
imagine,
more
yeah.
likely suspect.
Okay, fabulous. So if that was the kind of most important or transformational pitch, is there one that's got away? Is there a deal that you look back on, or an opportunity that you look at and you think, oh, if I knew I'd done that, or I'd have loved to had the chance to go down that route?
Yes, and I think what I always say to my clients, I'm often largely working with large corporates, and it's the importance of having a very rigorous win-loss review process in your business,
Right.
in your organization. So, if you win, don't just pop the champagne corks. Find out what it was that you won. Ask the client, what was it that we did that set us apart, and why? Please tell us why you chose us. And equally, and more painfully, is why did you not select us? Well, why did you deselect us? And there were although I and the people I work very closely with, we have a decent strike rate. You don't win them all, right? Or at least not yet. So got to keep trying. And definitely sitting in front of somebody, and there were two that stick out. One was the guy said, your proposal was too complicated. It was kind of difficult for us to see what we were actually getting. And in my one of my books, Neurosell, where I look at neuroscience, I say confused brains don't buy. And that came from that experience. So if we confuse them, we lose them. And I think the other one was, we should not have been in the room in the first place. We didn't qualify the opportunity properly. So really, we should have declined to bid, declined to be involved, say no. And that's the reason. If your sales pipeline is decent and healthy, you feel less desperation to we probably won't win it, but let's give it a go. That's not good enough, right? That's not good enough. We should often, I think that was a big learning for me, the painful learning, and that's why I'm obsessive about deal qualification. You've got to make sure you're spending your time and your focus on opportunities you're most likely to win, and have the courage sometimes to go, this isn't right for us. We're definitely not the best client, the best for you, Mr. or Mrs. Client. And those are those kind of, and the losses are painful. And that's sometimes, I think, why the learning sticks more.
I think often people are really reluctant to ask for feedback, especially when things haven't gone well. We've run a recruitment process recently, and several of the candidates got in touch and asked for feedback as to why they weren't selected. And I was very happy to do that, and offer people ideas and tips about what they could do differently in the future, and reassured them that in some instances it was like, we really liked you, you were fantastic, but it just wasn't quite the right fit for this particular role. Have you got any tips for how to go about asking for that feedback in those sorts of situations?
Yeah, I'd say, I think about what you would like to ask. I mean, I would normally say, questioning around it. Let's say we do the loss one first. It will be the same question both ways. why I would really like to understand why you've chosen or why you haven't chosen us. And then I think what you do have to
Yeah.
do, so you can't really script it. And I'm sales scripts, not a fan. I mean, this is
No.
not a sales situation, but scripts are for professional actors, right? Not for
Yeah.
salespeople. You would
And
know
even
all.
then, it's really
Yeah,
difficult.
yeah, sure. And then I think you have to. It's doing the questions that salespeople should be good at, right? Which is probing, and I'd be like to tell me more. And what made you say that? Because sometimes buying criteria, there will be explicit buying criteria that you might see in an RFP or whatever. But then there's always this subjective emotional involvement in decision making, and that's sometimes where you've got to
Yeah.
dig a little bit deeper, or and find out. And could you tell me why that's so important to you, or why we fell short on that? And I think tease it out, because you're looking sometimes for something that's more subjective and sometimes emotional and instinctive
Mhm.
that you've fallen
Yeah.
short of. And it's like you're saying, it was that fit. Like, they'll often, clients will often say, we want someone who fits our people, fits our culture. Really hard to calibrate how on earth do you measure that, right? So
Yeah.
it's that feeling part that's a very important part of decision making, right? Neuros, you've had Linda Shaw, Dr. Linda Shaw is wonderful.
Yeah.
Linda, I'm sure would back me up on the role of emotion in decision making. But keep digging, keep asking. Frame it right from the start, where you get that awful phone call that says, we like this,
Mm.
da da da. However, it's normally that structure that follows.
Yeah.
Or they say, hey, congratulations, we would love to work with you. I'd book that call straight away and start that framing exercise to give them a chance to think first, so that they can come prepared, rather than just, hey, Dominic, thanks for speaking. Why didn't we win? It's like, whoa,
Yeah.
let's warm it up like we would with a decent sales visit.
Yeah. It's really interesting as an actor. You used to go to hundreds of auditions that you didn't get.
Yeah,
And then when I started to direct and sit on the other side of the table, it really became apparent that, yeah, there were definitely things that people could do to influence the situation. But sometimes it really was those intangibles. And I think, when we're selling ourselves, and let's be honest, we're always pitching something, whether we consider ourselves to be in sales or not. We're taking an idea to our boss, or we're trying to convince our loved one to go to a particular restaurant. When we get that rejection, it's not always about something that we did and said. It could be completely about the other party or the other person,
yeah,
and there are things that are outside of our control. So I think if you do the basics, and I love your research story from your job interview. If you do those things well, then even if you don't succeed, you can still walk away with your head held high, and I think that's really important.
yeah. If you've done
So
everything you can do.
yes, and that's it. If you can hand on heart say that I pulled out all the stops, then to a certain extent, it's with the gods at that point. You're the author of 10 books. You've been endorsed by Dragon's Den, Duncan Bannatyne, Michael Dell from Dell Computers. You've spoken on sales for huge organizations around the world. But what is your story? Like, what did you want to be when you grow up? It sounds like the kind of sales thing came as a happy accident rather than something that was an early
Yeah,
focus.
I think the sales thing came about because I didn't know what I wanted to be when I grew up, right? That was that. Other than the normal thing as a kid, I don't know, astronaut or whatever we would quite like to be as children. So that was the exit from university. Sort of got my degree, not a particularly good one, because I spent far too much time having a good time and not enough time working. Probably partially because I guess, if I look back on it, kind of thinking, well, I definitely don't want to do this, and hence those sort of like typical post-university, if you don't know what you're going to do, jobs. And at one stage I was kind of driving a forklift truck in a welding machine warehouse, and was transferred into the office. The guy in the office wanted to come back into the warehouse, so I ended up sort of doing inbound customer inquiries, and that's sort of where it started, and was started to be, and he was a really grumpy kind of a guy, very impatient, Not, so I think by contrast, I must have just looked brilliant, just because, I'd pick up the phone and I'd be good morning, and he'd pick up, So I think the contrast was, and then somebody said to me, probably down the pub, one of my university friends, you should be in sales. You talk a lot, which is actually the worst advice. You actually listen a lot in sales. And then I started looking from that sort of customer service kind of internal role. And in the evenings, I started working door to door for organizations like Sky Television. So sort of success percentages that sounds like you experienced as an actor, Dominic, right? 1 in 20, 1 in 30. And I'm really glad I had that experience. I definitely would not want to do it now. Heaven help me. And then I sort of got a proper sales job, a telephone sales, internal sales job with a paper manufacturer. And that's when I was looking in the local paper, and I got the job in fast-moving consumer goods. So it was an accident, probably because of a lack of understanding of a career or a profession that I wanted to move into.
I mean, I always take my hat off to anyone who's done the kind of door-to-door thing, because I think it's probably the most brutal type of selling experience. Like, what were the kind of key learnings that you took from having to be rejected like that?
It was, I think the guy who was running the canvassing team was a bit of a veteran at this. And if I recall correctly, we were on about 25 quid if somebody signed up for Sky Television for a free. They would sign up. The first month was free, and then there was a recurring billing thing. And it was probably something like I say, 1 in 20, 1 in 30. So to some degree, it was a bit of a numbers game. And sales is not always a numbers game, but there'll often be a metrical factor. And he basically said something like, every time you knock on the door and get told no, or something a bit more explicit, it's one step closer to the yes. And he said, count the no's. And I can definitely remember at one stage going, knock, knock, no, knock, knock, no, knock, knock, off you go, going 50p, 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 50p. And, I was to the point where, and this was a long time ago, it was kind of about probably earning about £500 a week in the evenings, which was way more than my day job. And it was a fun team. They were fun. I can imagine the sort of people who are door-to-door canvassers, right? There's some real characters and some unusual folks. So it was quite a fun environment. And so, that was sort of the conditioning was to just keep on knocking, keep going.
So when you got into that more kind of formal sales role, more desk based, like were you a natural? What kind of early mistakes did you make?
I mean, I think again, I'd been following on. I was then hooked on learning, self learning, that sort of thing. So I'd be learning and listening to tapes and listening to recordings, and in the car on the way to work, and that's a habit that stayed with me ever since. Until somebody can identify DNA that says this is a natural born salesperson, I'm going to have to stick with the fact that it's a learned skill, it's a learned behavior. There could be some personality components that might make people more maybe better able to learn some of those skills and to do those kind of things. But it is definitely a learned kind of behavior. The company I work for sent us off one evening for Fred Pryor seminars, I seem to recall, like an evening on telephone. So I was brilliant, right? I just wrote down everything. The trainer was fantastic and started applying those things. And that was probably the first time I'd had any training that I hadn't initiated for myself. And I think that's what started me off down the path, which I work a lot of the time now, sort of training, coaching, etc., working with sales teams, because it makes a difference if you apply it. And I think
Absolutely.
I saw that direct correlation between, of course, that a fair bit of that role was cold calling new customers, but also warmish calling lapsed customers, as well as managing existing. So, that's kind of the tough end of sales. Hats off to anybody who does that, all the time. That's the tough end. And the better you are, the luckier you get.
Yeah, that's interesting. If you think about your career journey, you ended up as head of talent and development and leadership development for a large organization. And you've talked a lot about that kind of love of learning. So was that a natural pathway, and what were the steps that you took to upskill yourself?
Yeah, that was I suppose, not necessarily a natural progression, but it felt like it at the time. So I'd risen up through the ranks. So I was managing some large, significantly large customer accounts as sort of like account director, that sort of level. But as a sales manager, had just fallen in love with watching people grow and develop and playing some sort of role in that. And sort of fought a little bit of a battle with the business at the time, because they were quite keen for me to carry on being an account manager or account director and run the sector. And I really wanted to do the people stuff. So it got a bit uncomfortable for a while. And I think I wore them down into submission, and I ended up sort of heading up the sales academy. And then I guess the opportunity just came up to be head of leadership development for UK, and it was a very sales orientated business. So it was kind of like sales led culture. So there was still a sales vibe to it. And then after a reorganization, I was offered the sort of the Western European role, head of leadership and talent, which was great. And it gave me, because at that time I wanted international experience as well. So it got me outside the UK. Not just EMEA, but I also worked with and ran programs in Brazil and Canada and America and things like that. So I started to get that, because that was something I was really into at the time. And I remember when I did my MSc with the company business school. I actually ended up running the business school at one stage, which was quite cool, because I was doing my MSc as well. So I wasn't allowed to award it. I wasn't allowed to award it to myself. I hasten to add. And my prof, who was like supporting me through it, he said, "Your USP," he said, "is you're a commercial person in this L&D HR world." He said, "So if you combine your commercial nous and your commercial experience with the development of people," he said, "that's a great combination to have." And I think, and that coaching advice from Prof Hayden was I think helped me to shape that idea as well.
Amazing. What did you learn about kind of people's capacity and desire, I suppose, to grow? Because you must have seen a lot of different learners on that journey.
Yeah, I think particularly when you're looking at quote unquote talent, and there are all sorts of different definitions, but it's often people who have an above average capacity or capability to contribute. So, it's trying to identify performance at one level in an organization doesn't necessarily equate to success at the next level of challenge. The classic problem is that you make the best salesperson the sales manager of the team. And those are two different job roles. And sometimes you end up sort of losing your best salesperson and ending up with a very average sales manager, because they've got to make that step up. And I think you've got to know what to stop doing to step up, and you've got to know what to start doing. And it's probably the stop doing that is the biggest handicap. So I describe it as sales managers who become super reps, and they've got a team of 8, or I had a team of 10. If you're trying to get involved in closing every deal, because, hey, I'm a great closer, and you're too actively involved, one, you suppress the capability of those people because you turn up and try and take over and be the hero, and you're spreading yourself too thin. Your job is to empower your people to close those sales or to win that business or to do whatever it is. So I think it is that capacity to be able to step up. And I think it's Ram Charan, Stephen Trotter, I think the Harvard Business Review article or research, if I recall correctly, was around this leadership pipeline. What are the transitional points that people need to make? But also, we would always, the company was very performance orientated, kind of meritocracy. If you're good enough, you're ready. But it would always be, are they performing at the current level? And if not, we didn't talk about any further progression, so that was always and yes, they say they're ambitious. Oh yeah, I definitely want to further my career, and I'll work anywhere in the world. Okay, we got a vacancy I remember particularly, got a vacancy in Russia. Not sure about that. So it was always be, are they ambitious? Can we prove it? They'd all say, yeah, I'm ambitious. Right. And you say, okay, we got this really stretching, challenging assignment. And they'd all go, no. Ooh, so I'm not that ambitious, right? So there has to be that drive, I think, and desire that suits that person. Because to take on those more challenging roles, there's going to be some sacrifice, right? It's going to be some stretch. You're going to go well outside your comfort zone, and not everybody's prepared to do that. And I know no criticism of those people. Not everybody wants to do that. Absolutely wonderful. If that's what's right for you, fantastic. But I think don't pretend to be ambitious.
I mean, I think if I think about the audience that listens to this podcast, I would say most people that are listening right now are listening because they want to try and improve themselves. Yeah. They're inspired to learn. So you've obviously had lots of teachers over the years. You are now the guru, the teacher yourself. But what was your approach to gathering knowledge? How did you select who to listen to?
I would definitely say randomly to begin with. I was given, luckily, given those books, you should read those. And I think that starts a process of one person leads to another person, and you start to, so, you start to look at those sort of things. As I've, I hope matured, hopefully matured and developed, I'm less impressed with what I might call the more shallow, motivational, rah-rah kind of stuff. That was very heavily influenced. I made my masters. I looked at a lot around performance management and the psychology of performance. And, there's a lot of quite shallow stuff around goal setting and these spurious stories about Yale University. And when you dig into a lot of them, there is no substance behind them. There is nothing. There's nothing at all. So they're nice little motivational sound bites. What I increasingly wanted to say, okay, where's the evidence? Where's the research? Where's the science? Where's the backup that proves this to be the case? So I'm hoping I've become a bit more discerning, and I would describe myself as an open-minded skeptic. I'm really happy to be convinced, but I need to see some evidence, some data. I'm a big fan of data for sales managers. When you're managing your team, you're managing your sales pipeline, what's the data to insight to action, and also coaching salespeople. So has this person got the decision-making authority to sign off $1 million? Oh yeah, I think so. Okay, do you think so or do you know so? Right, until it comes out of the customer's mouth. That's conjecture, right? And suddenly you find out they haven't got the authority to sign off, and bang, away you go. So I think that's made me a bit more intolerant of the shallow sort of flim flam kind of stuff. Where's the substance? Because intrinsic motivation is probably what's most important. Extrinsic will vanish reasonably quickly.
Yeah. Your book series, the titles start with bare knuckle. So
Yes.
we've got bare knuckle selling, bare knuckle negotiating, bare knuckle customer service. Where does that idea come from?
That came from another dodgy student job, which was doing security for concerts and events. Had a great time, some fantastic bands, and sometimes some bands have a bit of a following that is a bit lively, to say the least. And I was studying traditional Japanese karate, wada ryu, and great style, but a lot of the things in it are traditional. There are certain things that are done for traditional reasons. And I guess in one or two sort of altercations that unfortunately invariably occur, somebody's had too much to drink or whatever, that what works in the dojo in theory doesn't work in reality. So it was kind of like the bare knuckle concept was, let's strip it back to actually what does, the way we would do these flying jumping kicks or whatever, that was originally designed to dislodge samurai horsemen, right? As though you're going to find one of those amongst a group of 500 skinheads at a Bad Manners concert when it all kicks off.
Yeah.
So I think that instilled that philosophy of like what actually works, and that was, for better or for worse, that became the bare knuckle kind of concept.
Love it. So so how did you then go and distill that down and test what works? Was that tested in the field yourself, or was that with
very
clients?
much so. So really, the first couple of books were what I was training salespeople at the time, based on what was good, well-established discipline in a disciplined sales environment. Fast-moving consumer goods companies are often very disciplined, clear standards, well-founded in a good base of experience. And then field tested myself, field by my own application of those principles, then as a sales manager coaching and seeing that when a salesperson applied those principles, when they did good in-depth questioning and needs finding, they were better able to articulate the value of the brands or the products or the services. And you would see the success rate rise as they applied those kind of proven principles. So, it's kind of like it was the books were a download of that philosophy and that concept.
And then the next book was Neuroselling. So you took a slightly different kind of approach there, I suppose.
Yeah, it was the Inner Winner was in between, which was where I took my master's thesis, which was very academic, and turned it into around performance psychology, sort of popularized it, but kept all the references. And a Neurosell, that was partially driven by a desire to get a very big named publisher sort of on my resume. I worked with a very innovative publisher for the first books, who I still work with and dearly love, but I kind of wanted the kudos of like a Kogan Page, which is where we ended up. So that was a pitching process to win over the editor at Kogan Page. But I'd was doing some learning myself. It was a neuroscience-based profiling instrument called PRISM, PRISM, PRISM brain mapping, and it was kind of a 2-day program. And on the way home after day one, with my brain firing off with all of this sort of fantastic insight into neuroscience, I got stuck in the traffic on the M1 for about 2 hours. The motorway was shut, so I had my pad with me, and I just brain downloaded neuroscience and selling. My brain was on fire right now. And then the following day, I went back, and the guy who was running the training, Dr. Colin Wallace, an expert in applied neuroscience, I took him on one side and I said, Colin, I really think there should be a book on this. And he smiled and he said, if you write it, I will help you. And he's such a generous guy. So, and it was the toughest book to write because Inner Winner was tougher, but I'd done the research. But everything in Neurosell I wanted to make sure was absolutely scientifically accurate. So the rigor was tough. And that's that fascination in psychology led to a fascination in neuroscience, which is all around understanding what makes people tick. which helps you yourself to be more successful, but also helps you to understand what's going on inside that brain when they're making decisions.
And what are some of the fundamental or foundational principles that listeners should be thinking about from a neuroscience perspective when they're engaging in selling conversations?
So I mentioned, the one principle, if you confuse them, you lose them, right? Confused brains don't buy. So I say that came out of harsh learning. The other one is uncomfortable brains don't buy. So I think what it actually is proof of the old adage of relationship matters. So we've got to make sure the customer feels comfortable, psychologically comfortable with us, or emotionally comfortable with us. Which then facilitates a better level of questioning, a better level of understanding, and helps that emotional connection in the brain. So where the human brain is not vastly dissimilar to what it was 100,000 years ago, because evolution is a relatively slow process. So there's still functionality in there that's still very influential, and so we have to appeal to the emotional aspect of the sale as well. So I guess what I did is I put in a tried and tested and proven sales process and turbocharged it with the insights from neuroscience at each stage of the process.
Yeah. It's fascinating that you talk about emotion, because again, from an acting perspective, it's all about how you make other people feel. Like if you're in a scene, okay, you get a script which is slightly different from a sales conversation, but you've got a script, you've got the author's kind of intention, you know what the arc of the story is going to be, and your job is to emotionally influence the other person. So I talk a lot about what's your emotional intention, how are you trying to leave them feeling at the end of the conversation compared to where they were at the beginning. And as actors, that's incredibly instinctive. But what I've found working with corporate people in the corporate world is that sometimes we get stuck in our heads, and it's all about, here are the features and the benefits, and this is as you say, this is all the stuff that I could tell you about this, but the connection disappears. So the audience feels completely kind of overwhelmed, and doesn't know how to buy because they've got no emotional connection with what you're talking about.
I think we're very much on the same page, because I'll often say with pitches, presentations, calls, meetings, first thing from a planning point of view, what do we want the customer to think, feel, and do at the end, which is in line with what you're saying. So, Alan Weiss, the American author and speaker and consultant, he's 50 books or something, $1 million speaking, $1 million consulting, etc. Great, some really great stuff. And in one of his books that I've been reading recently, he'll say logic makes people think, emotion makes people act. And I think that's that important of, we need the two together. But that's why I say that what's the do? What's the do? How will you know when you've been successful? And that also aligns with all the research that's been done into the psychology of goal setting or objective setting, that people with clear goals, clear outcomes, will perform better than people who don't have that. And a lot of salespeople go into meetings with a very woolly, hazy idea of the outcome that they want to get. And although you need more than just the outcome clear in mind, it is a clear determinant of success. So very important. It's the first thing to get.
It's that compass, isn't it? Like how do you know whether you're on track or off track if you haven't actually picked that destination and really kind of defined it and understood, where it is that you're going. You talked a moment ago about that connection with audience, and I think one of the challenges that people find in a pitching context is that sometimes you're walking into a room full of strangers. So you might have had the RFP, you might have been kind of conversing on email, maybe you've had the odd Teams call to ask a few questions and make any clarifications, but oftentimes you walk into that room and at least 50% of the people are brand new. What's the best way to be able to connect and put people at ease in those
Yeah.
situations?
So firstly, I would always recommend find out, if you've not been told, find out who is going to be sitting on the panel. And then you need to have a look at their LinkedIn profiles, Google them, sort of find out who they are. Because I think what that does is that helps you to feel slightly more familiar with them, so they're not necessarily a stranger. You know what they look like. The LinkedIn profile might be a bit out of date. They might have put on a bit of weight or lost some hair. I know that feeling. But I think that helps, because they're not a stranger. Then there is also the chance that, and I've had slightly backfire, which I'm happy to mention in a moment. It's not backfire, but they might see you've been looking, and they might look at your profile. Or as well, there is a chance, if they're doing a good job, they will have a look and see who's turning up. And you'll often see in your LinkedIn stats, Fred blogs, Frederica blogs has looked at your profile. Hence, that's a really good reason that your LinkedIn profile needs to be customer focused, have a decent photo, etc. So, because stranger danger, the brain, I don't know you, so therefore I'm slightly on edge. So I think there's things you can't control this, right? But you can maximize the chances of them seeing something they like. And then I think get yourself psychologically prepared before you go in. Do not sit down in the foyer in the big comfortable chair, because you go in, your clothes get all wrinkled, your energy level drops, and when they come in, it's really good that you're up, you're standing, you're looking kind of ready to go. And it's better to, you'll know about this as an actor, right? It's better to manage your state, etc. Standing, it's easier, you get more blood supply to the brain, you can stand in that Professor Amy Cuddy, that upright posture, those sort of things. So you're in a kind of a great place. And then just don't forget the basics. Just don't forget the basics of a firm handshake, a smile. Those sort of things is really good. If possible, I try and avoid sort of doing the setting up, plugging in. If you're going to use slides, try and avoid that, sort of like, because they're sitting watching you setting up, and you feel a bit under pressure. You hope everything's going to work. So, if at all possible, try to control that and say, could we get in a bit early and have a few. But just don't forget that natural. A smile is non-threatening. I was with a salesperson one time, and we're doing some consultancy. So I was out with a number of salespeople, seeing how they did things and sort of feeding back to the organization. And I said to this sales guy, super guy, really nice guy. I said, "Do you?" It was tongue in cheek, right? I said, "Do you like your job?" And he goes, "Oh yeah, I love my job. Yeah." I said, "Enjoy it." He goes, "Yeah." I said, "Try telling your face," right? Because he was like looking so. And I said, "Look, we can be, I'm not talking about going, hey, look at me. Just the first time you meet them, let's just do that engagement, that warm smile, make decent eye contact, be conscious of non-threatening body language, don't proxemics, don't get too close, all of that good stuff, but make that positive first impression. And then, of course, if it becomes a more serious conversation, you can dial down the smile. But the initial part is you've got to make that emotional. And people do judge on appearance. Sadly, people do. My wife and I were in Wagamama's, the kind of Japanese sort of themed restaurant, and they sat us down, and the person said, "Oh, your waiter will be over in a moment," and in she came. The waiter came to the table. I have never seen anybody with more facial piercings or tattoos in my life. And I've got to be honest, initially it was just like, well, I've got lots of friends with tattoos and piercings. It wasn't, but this was like, wow, like that. And I remember sort of going, wow, never been looked after by a more professional, friendly waiter in my life. But those first few seconds were, blimey, that is, and it's wrong to be judgmental, but that is what customers. So what is their dress code? What is their culture? Can you make sure, if it's advertising, marketing, you can just tell it's lively, energetic kind of
Yeah.
place. You know, I had a meeting in London with one of our clients, a specialty insurance company, and the coup and the CEO in their city suits, pinstripes, regimental tie, school tie, very, very shiny skin.
Mm-hmm.
And this was back in the day before, and the reason I use this example, it's the biggest contrast I think I've ever had in one day. And in the afternoon I was meeting Skype before they were bought by Microsoft. And I'm like the only person in their office in a suit. Like
Suit,
everybody,
yeah.
you know. And I don't know if you've ever tried to establish any sense of gravitas sitting on a giant beanbag in a chill out room, sitting in a suit. You know.
Didn't work.
No, it was fine. It was fine. But then I'm really conscious that as I was walking in, you could see people going, man in a suit.
Yeah.
You know, man in a suit. What's he? He must be like, it must be some consultant or an accountant or something. So.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I think the other thing that people forget in those situations is actually, the people that you're pitching to do want to employ someone. They want to say yes.
Yes.
They're looking for someone to solve their problem, and sometimes we can kind of think we're going to be judged and they're going to pick our proposal to bits and it's going to be combative. I mean, there will be the odd like hardcore procurement team that will be there to rip everything to shreds, but in 95% of cases, people's intention from an audience perspective is to appoint a contractor, a supplier, a person that they want to work with. And so if we can serve them in that way, it's very different.
And I think also building on that, once you've hopefully established that reasonable, positive, first few seconds, make a statement right at the start. Is our understanding of the purposes of today is for you to decide if you want to carry on talking to us or not. And that's typically what I'll say. So my understanding of the purpose of today is for you to decide if you want to carry on talking to me about making use of me as a consultant to help you transform the performance of your organization or not. And I always verbalize the or not, because that is the purpose of the day. But it also, I think, just helps to say, I understand you've got a choice. I respect that fact. And it also, my feeling is, and I've no evidence for this, so contrary to my normal thing, it might also help me to look slightly less desperate, because desperation is a really unattractive property. If you're starting to look desperate for the business, I'm not sure that's going down well with the client.
Yeah, absolutely. What other mistakes? I mean, you must have seen, thousands, if not tens of thousands of pitches now. So what other kind of big mistakes are you seeing people make when they're engaging with their audience?
The big mistake, one of my favorite expressions is lead to what you do, don't lead with what you do. So I've done pitching, proposal, value prop workshops in many, many, many industries in all sorts of different countries. And I'm slightly poking fun when I say this, but it is also very true. It's the same 5 or 6 PowerPoint slides every single time. So we'll ask sales teams to bring, or even very senior account managers, right? Very experienced people. Bring your proposal, pitch deck, whatever it is, bring it to the session. We're going to workshop it. And we get them to run through it. And slide 1 is the title slide. And then they've put the customer's logo in one corner of it. And that's customized, right? And I've even had them leaving the previous customer's name or logo on the next slide, which probably doesn't, doesn't feel awfully personal. And then, agenda slide, nothing wrong with that. Set the scene. Although you can use your agenda slide, better than just a list of things you're going to cover. And then it'll invariably be a couple of slides, 2 slides. One is, here's some stuff about us, here we're great, aren't we slide, we're this big and we do this. And then there's another slide, just in case you're not fully convinced, here's some awards we've won. Customers never heard of them, they don't really care. And then there might be if it's a global company, the ubiquitous map of the world showing all of our office locations, even a customer, a guy who was pitching to a business that only worked in the UK, spent about 3 minutes talking about their expansion into Asia Pacific. I was just like that. And then the history of the company slide. And my all-time favourite was the two gentlemen who founded the company in 1887. Like, the old brown Victorian moustaches, and afterwards I'm like, why have you got that picture in there? And he said, well, very proudly, it's our heritage. And I said, I don't think the customer cares at this stage. I am not saying your global capability is not important if they are looking for a global provider. I'm not saying it's not. It is incredibly impressive that you've been around since 18 blah blah blah. But in the first 5 minutes I'd start by talking about them. So here's what we understand you're looking for. Here's what we understand is important to you. Here's what we understand are the results you want to achieve. And then here's how we think we can help you to achieve. So I think they've got it the wrong way around. So you lead to what you do rather than leading. And also I think that helps to differentiate you, because if my experiences, and I've seen a lot of these, that's probably the reason people don't differentiate very well. That was the CEB research. 75% of salespeople believe they were doing a good job of showing why their company is better or differentiating themselves, but only 3% of customers agreed. And that's because I think largely it's the same 6 slides. I mean, their eyes customers' eyes just glaze. Oh my goodness, here we go again, right?
So if that's the kind of beginning, how do we end? What's the strategy for wrapping things up? Because I think that's another thing that I observe a lot, is that everything just sort of like fades out. It's like one of those bad 1980s pop songs where they couldn't actually find the final chord, so they just dialed down the volume.
Yes, I love it. Yeah, I think I've danced to a few of those in a few nightclubs in the 1980s. Very, very badly, I should hasten to add. One thing I would say is never ever finish a pitch on a Q&A. Never finish on a Q&A, because the energy is weak, the energy drops. So what typically will happen is you'll do your presentation, and then you say, now we'd obviously like to invite you to answer questions. I'm a big fan of questioning throughout the pitch, because it actually makes it an interactive conversation. Forrester research was, if memory serves me, 88% of C-level executives want a conversation, not a presentation, for sales-related matters. But I think that's so you can have a few slides potentially as backdrop. I'm not saying don't, but they want a conversation. But however, there's normally at the end, there'll be a Q&A. And typically it goes like, anybody got a question? You get a question, you answer it. You get a question, you answer it. You get a question, you answer it. And then there's this horrible moment or awkward moment. Any further questions? And there's that tumbleweed, and then the pitching people will say, oh, okay, then, if there's no further questions, thank you very much for your time and the energy. So as part of, in line with your think, feel, do, what's your main message? What's your main message? What are your 3 key points that support your main message? Where's your facts to back it up? And then use that throughout the presentation. And then at the end say, okay, well, thank you very much. If there's no further questions, just in summary, and whack them with the thing you most want them to remember. What is the 2 or 3 things you most want the customer or the client to remember as you leave the room? And if you've done a better job of implanting that, when they do the round the table discussion, who do you think we should go to first? Who do you think? They'll go, well, I do think that, and they'll say, because boom, 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 and you've implanted those, you've repeated those. Repetition drives retention, and if you talk to people like David Thomas, good friend of mine, a memory expert, I'm sure David would say, primacy and recency, first bit, last bit, people tend to remember. Whack them with a good strong finish. Start strong to grab their attention, finish strong. Leave that lasting message.
Yeah, we're absolutely aligned on that. I think it's such solid advice. It's so easy to just sort of fade out and leave that kind of awkward situation where potentially the last question that you answered was like weirdly technical, or maybe you didn't necessarily nail the answer to that question. But if you can come back with, so in conclusion, bang, buy us because A, B, and C, we'd love to work with you, then that's the feeling that you
Yeah.
walk out with in the room, which is
Or,
so
or,
important.
or if maybe the last question is a difficult one that you're not sure you've answered particularly well, that would be the lasting impression. And that wouldn't be
Which
a
is
great place.
even worse. Yeah. Simon, I could chat all day. It's been absolutely fantastic picking your brains. I've got a final question for you. If you could go back to that young man working in the bingo hall, what advice would you give to him in terms of moving his career forward?
Yeah, I was asked this on another podcast last month, and it would be get a really good job with a really good professional business that believes in training and learning and development at an early formative stage, because it will set you up. It will provide you with a solid foundation of professional persuasion and sales discipline for the rest of your career. Mine was a lucky accident, and I'd say just get in with a really great and my first boss was okay. My second boss was coaching before coaching was invented. And he was the guy who turned me from a overly confident, maybe, my confidence exceeded my competence at the time, into something resembling a decent account manager through support, challenge, coaching, etc. So the value of a good coach or a good mentor at any stage of your career is very important. But at an early stage, wow, and how good a place would you be, right? You're well trained, you're well developed, good foundation, and then if you got a and this kind of comes from my traditional Japanese karate, right? Because no matter what color belt you've got around your waist, every training session would start with repeating the basic techniques again and again and again. So you have to become brilliant at the basics. If you, as my sensei told me off one time because I wasn't paying attention properly, if you build a house on weak foundations, the house falls over. So weak foundations, weak karate, strong foundations, strong karate. So strong foundations, strong selling and persuasion, weak foundations, weak selling. So become brilliant at the basics, then you have a foundation upon which you can build mastery.
Amazing advice. Simon, thank you so much for joining me
pleasure,
on the podcast.
Dominic.
Thanks for listening to the Why Life's a Pitch podcast. If you'd like to improve the way you pitch and communicate, I'm giving away a special gift to all my listeners. We've developed the Pitching with Impact scorecard to help you benchmark your pitch performance in 6 key areas. It'll take you less than 5 minutes to complete, and you'll receive a detailed, personalized report packed full of insights and ideas to help you improve and grow. Just head over to dominiccolenso.com/scorecard to get started.